You are performing right now. You have been performing since you walked in the room. The question is not whether anyone noticed. The question is what you gave up to make sure they did. Welcome to the Stoic Compass. I am Epictetus, and today I am joined by Carl Jung and Lao Tzu. Today we are examining why do we work so hard to appear powerful, and what does it cost us? Let us start with what is actually happening. You spend enormous energy managing how you look. You choose your words to signal strength. You hold back vulnerability because vulnerability feels like exposure. You posture. And then you call that strategy. But here is what I want you to answer honestly. If no one were watching, would you still do it? If the answer is no, then you are not building power. You are building a stage set, and a stage set is not a house. It will not hold you when the storm comes.
I would not disagree that performance is happening, but I think you are too quick to condemn it. The persona, what I call the mask we wear for the world, is not simply vanity, it is a psychological necessity. The question is not whether someone wears a mask, but whether they know they are wearing it. The person who performs power without awareness is being driven by something they cannot see. The person who knows the mask is a mask can choose when to put it down. Most people Epictetus is scolding do not know they have a choice because they are not even aware they made one.
You are both arguing about the mask, but you are missing the stranger question. Why does this particular mask keep getting chosen? Power, strength, dominance, these are not random selections. Something underneath is running the decision. And neither of you is asking what that is.
Then I will ask it. Fear, that is what is underneath. The person performing power is afraid of being dismissed, overlooked, treated as nothing. And I do not say that as a condemnation, I say it as a diagnosis. Fear is workable, fear can be addressed, but not by layering more performance on top of it. If you are afraid you are not enough, no amount of projecting power will fix that, because the fear is not coming from the outside. You cannot solve an internal problem with an external display.
Fear, yes, but what kind of fear? This is where precision matters. The person performing power is not simply afraid of others. They are afraid of a part of themselves. What I see clinically, again and again, is that the drive to appear powerful is almost always a compensation for an internalized sense of inadequacy that was formed early. Not chosen, formed. The child who was humiliated, dismissed, or treated as invisible does not simply decide one day to perform strength. They build it as a survival structure. And that structure follows them into adulthood, not because they are weak, but because the original wound was never brought into the light. The performance is not a lie. It is a very old answer to a very real pain.
That may be true, but knowing the origin of the wound does not automatically dissolve the behavior. People can understand exactly where their compulsions came from and still be entirely in their grip. Understanding is not the same as freedom. I am less interested in the origin than in the mechanics. What is it that keeps the performance running right now in this moment? It runs because there is a belief, usually unexamined, that stopping it would be dangerous, that without the display, something would collapse.
And I want to press on that. What would actually collapse? Be specific. If you stop performing power for one day, if you let someone see you uncertain or said, "I do not know" in a meeting, or admitted a mistake without immediately framing it as a lesson, what would actually happen? In most cases, very little. In many cases, people would trust you more. The fear tells you the stakes are enormous. The reality is usually far smaller. This is where Stoic practice is useful, not as philosophy, but as an experiment. Test the fear. See if the catastrophe actually arrives.
I agree that the catastrophe usually does not arrive in the external world. But Epictetus, you are still operating on the surface. The catastrophe the psyche fears is not social rejection, it is the collapse of the self-image. If a person has built their entire sense of identity around being someone who projects strength, then dropping the performance even once is not just a social risk. It is an existential one. It feels like annihilation. The ego does not distinguish between someone might think less of me and I might cease to exist. That is not dramatic. That is how the psyche actually works when a core wound is touched.
And this is where I think you are both pointing at something real, but from angles that still accept a shared assumption. You are both treating the self that performs as the real self and the performance as the distortion. But what if the boundary between the two is not as clean as you are suggesting? What if the performance and the performer are less separate than they appear?
That sounds like a reason to avoid the work.
Or it is an observation that the work you are describing, stripping away the performance to find the authentic self underneath, may not be the only available move. I am not saying do nothing. I am saying the framing of authentic self versus false persona may itself be part of the trap.
That is genuinely interesting, and I am not dismissing it. But in practice, there is something that does shift when a person begins to see their patterns honestly. Whether we call that authentic self or not, something loosens. The compulsion loses some of its grip. I have seen it.
So have I, and I will tell you what I think loosens it: attention. Not introspection, attention. When you actually watch yourself in the act of performing, when you catch the impulse in real time before it completes itself, something changes. You are no longer inside the machinery, you're watching it run, and from there you can choose. That is the only place choice exists, in the gap between the impulse and the action.
The gap you are describing is real, but most people do not live in that gap. They live at full speed, and the faster they move, the less space there is to notice anything at all. You cannot catch the impulse if you have built a life that leaves no room for stillness. Speed is part of the performance. Busyness is part of the performance. Filling every moment is a way of never having to face the question of who you are when you stop.
That is exactly right. And I would add, what fills those moments is often the maintenance of the image, the checking of how one appeared in the last interaction, the rehearsal of how one will appear in the next one. The mind is almost constantly engaged in reputation management, and most people do not experience this as a burden. They experience it as normal. The suffering it creates, the anxiety, the exhaustion, the loneliness that comes from never being actually known, they attribute to other causes.
The loneliness. Let us stay there for a moment because I think that is the real cost, and most people have not named it. When you are always performing power, you cannot be helped. You cannot receive. You cannot admit that something is hard, and so you are sealed inside the performance. People around you see the image, they respond to the image. And you, the actual person with actual fears and actual needs, are completely alone in there. You built a wall to keep danger out. The wall worked, and now you are alone inside it.
And the wall feels like protection until you notice that nothing alive can get in either. Not the real regard of another person, not your own honesty about what you actually want, not the possibility that you might be wrong and that being wrong might be instructive. The performance locks out the very things that would make the original fear smaller.
Which means the performance is self-defeating in precisely the way the ego cannot see. The persona was built to make us more safe, more accepted, more powerful. But it creates exactly the isolation it was meant to prevent. This is the shadow at work. The very thing we suppress to appear strong becomes the thing that undermines us. We suppress need so we cannot receive. We suppress doubt so we cannot learn. We suppress softness so nothing reaches us. And we cannot see any of this because seeing it would require us to look at the part of ourselves we have decided does not exist.
The shadow is real, I will grant Jung that, but knowing about the shadow does not dissolve it. At some point you have to act differently. You have to actually put the performance down, even once, even in a small way, and discover that the world does not end. That is not just philosophy, that is the test. Without the test, the insight is decorative.
Action, yes, but not forced action. Not now I will strategically demonstrate vulnerability in 3 calculated steps. That is still performance. What actually shifts is not a decision to act differently. It is a moment of seeing clearly enough that the old move loses its automatic quality. You do not stop performing because you decided to stop. You stop because, just for a moment, you saw what you were doing and it did not look like strength anymore.
That moment has to be cultivated. It does not arrive on its own for most people. This is why practice matters. Not as punishment, not as self-improvement theater, but as attention training. You practice noticing. You practice catching yourself before the impulse completes. And over time, not overnight, but over time, the gap between impulse and action grows wide enough that you can actually stand in it.
And in that gap, if you are willing, you can ask the harder question, what is this protecting? Not as a rhetorical question, but as a genuine one. When I am about to project authority, I do not feel or dismiss someone before they can dismiss me, or perform certainty I do not have. What is the wound underneath that move? That question, asked sincerely and repeatedly, begins to do real work.
You will notice the cost more clearly if you look not at what the performance gains, but at what it makes impossible. The performance of power makes certain things impossible. Real listening is impossible because the performer is always managing. Real connection is impossible because the performer cannot be known. Real rest is impossible because the performance must be maintained. When you see that list honestly, the cost is not abstract.
Nothing about this requires a particular belief system. It requires honesty. And honesty is the most uncomfortable practice there is because it does not ask you to add anything. It asks you to stop pretending.
The river does not announce that it is powerful, it simply moves. Everything in its path eventually accommodates. That is not strategy. That is just what happens when something is completely itself.
And there is your test. Not, how do I appear more powerful, but what would I actually do if I were not managing the appearance? The answer to that question is the only one worth knowing.
And arriving at that answer requires passing through the thing you have been most carefully avoiding. The honest recognition that the performance is costing you more than it is giving you. Most people will not sit with that recognition. They will deflect it, rationalize it, or reframe it as pragmatism. The ones who can hold it, just hold it without immediately resolving it. Those are the ones who actually change.
You do not have to resolve it. You just have to stop looking away.
All of this debate and the hardest thing has barely been touched. Not why we perform, not what it costs, but what it would mean to actually put it down. Here is what performance of power actually costs you. Not reputation, not respect. Those may fluctuate regardless of what you do. What it costs you is access to your own clarity. When you are managing how you appear, a significant portion of your attention is committed to the management. It is not available for thinking. It is not available for listening. It is not available for solving the actual problem in front of you. You are running two processes simultaneously, the task and the image of yourself doing the task, and neither one gets your full capacity. This is not a moral failing, it is a practical one, and practical problems have practical remedies. The remedy is not to become someone who does not care what others think. That is not freedom, that is another kind of performance. The remedy is this: learn to distinguish in real time between action that comes from what you actually see and believe and action that comes from how you want to be perceived. You will notice the difference if you pay attention. One has a particular quality of directness to it. The other has a slight lag, a small calculation behind it. Today, notice that lag just once. You do not have to change what you do. Find one moment where you catch the calculation happening, where you feel yourself choosing words or posture or tone for effect rather than for truth. Just see it, name it to yourself. The seeing is already the beginning of the gap, and the gap is where you actually live. The performance did not make you powerful, it made you busy. There is a version of you that does not need the room to believe anything in particular, and that version is quieter, more capable, and completely available the moment you stop spending yourself on the display. You know what it feels like to be in a room with someone who is not performing. It feels like solid ground. You have wanted to be in that room your whole life. You can build it, but not by adding anything, only by stopping. If today's conversation has served you, take it further. Pay Attention by C. Tribune, 12 Lessons in the Practice of Seeing Clearly. Available now on Amazon.